Today the companion application gets its first Blazor form. A permitted user can enter a work item title, submit it through the existing ASP.NET Core API, see the normalized title returned by the server, and start again with a clear field. If the API rejects the title, the exact safe title message appears beside the input. If the user must sign in, lacks permission, loses the network, or receives an unusable response, the page explains the right next step without exposing server detail. The finished slice is hosted, keyboard-friendly, and covered by component, adapter, and real host tests. Keep the mental model small. The Blazor component is not a second application service and it is not a shortcut to EF Core. It is a client of the same feature contract used by any other front end. The API still owns title validation, identity, permission checks, creation, persistence, and normalization. A tiny HTTP adapter turns transport details into outcomes such as created, validation, forbidden, unauthorized, or failure. The component then maps those outcomes into success text, field errors, or an alert. Each layer translates one boundary, and the server remains the single source of truth. The new WebAssembly client is hosted by the existing web application, so the page and API share one origin. Its HTTP client uses the host base address, and the adapter posts to the relative API/workitems route. For browser sessions, the request explicitly includes browser credentials so the identity cookie can travel with the call. That avoids copying access tokens into local storage or JavaScript. The host serves Blazor framework files, static assets, and a fallback to index.html after the API endpoints are mapped. A real host test requests the form route and proves that the Blazor boot script is present. Instead of giving the component an HTTP response message, define a narrow result vocabulary. Created carries the identifier and normalized title. Validation carries the problem details field dictionary. Forbidden and unauthorized are separate marker results, and failure represents an outcome that is safe to retry or report generically. This is not a generic result framework. It is a small public interface designed around the decisions this form must make. Transport parsing stays in HTTP work item API, while markup stays in the component. Tests can now substitute the interface with one chosen result and verify page behavior without starting a browser or database. The form binds one title and handles submit rather than inventing a second client-side length rule. Submit clears old messages, sets an in-progress flag, and passes the user's value to iWorkItem API. Notice that the component does not trim before sending. The server owns normalization and returns the value it accepted. When created arrives, the page displays that trusted title and clears the input. On every rejected or technical outcome, the input stays in place so the user can correct or retry it. The disabled submit button also prevents accidental duplicate clicks while the call is running. A 400 response contains the existing validation problem contract. The adapter deserializes its errors dictionary, and the component selects only the expected title key before rendering messages beside that field. Whitelisting matters. A user interface should not blindly print every key or arbitrary server text into the page. The input sets ARIA invalid when the list is non-empty and points to the error container with ARIA describedb. Do not copy the 3 to 120 character rule into Blazor just to make the form feel responsive. We can add client hints later, but the API response remains authoritative and fully tested. The status code distinction from episode for now becomes useful interface behavior. Unauthorized means no usable identity reached the endpoint, so the page asks the user to sign in. Forbidden means the identity is known but does not satisfy workitems.create, so repeating login is not presented as a fix. Network errors, unexpected status codes, malformed JSON, and even a valid null response become one authored retry message. The adapter never passes raw response bodies or exception text into the component. That protects users from confusing implementation detail and reduces the chance of leaking sensitive server information through a friendly-looking error panel. The tests match the boundaries. bUnit renders the actual Razor component, changes the field, submits the form, and checks success, validation, unauthorized, forbidden, and safe failure states. A stub iWork item API makes each page decision deterministic. Separate HTTP work item API tests drive a custom message handler and prove the outgoing JSON plus created, validation, access, network, malformed, null, and unexpected responses. Finally, Web Application Factory requests /work item /new from the real host and confirms the Blazor application is served. The entire release suite now has 21 passing tests, 0 failures, 0 warnings, and no vulnerable packages. 3 convenient shortcuts would weaken this slice. First, injecting the DB context or store into a server-side component would bypass the tested HTTP, authentication, and authorization boundary, and it would not work in WebAssembly anyway. Second, duplicating the title rule in the browser and assuming it is enough lets other clients submit invalid data and creates 2 rules that can drift. Third, converting every non-success response into something went wrong hides whether login, permission, input, or infrastructure is the issue. Keep the server authoritative, translate only known safe data, and write explicit user messages for the actions the person can actually take. We added a hosted Blazor WebAssembly client without changing the work item API, domain model, database mapping, or authorization policy. The form sends one title, trusts the normalized created response, renders the server's title validation safely, distinguishes sign-in from missing permission, and preserves input across technical failures. The HTTP adapter contains transport detail, the component contains presentation state, the API remains the source of truth. 21 tests prove the component, adapter, host, identity policy, persistence, and owner isolation together. In Episode 6, we return to EF Core and stop lost updates with optimistic concurrency while keeping this user-facing boundary intact.